This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. The Great Himalayan Trail is one of the highest and longest trails in the world. Between April and June of 2013, Doc McKerr became the first person to solo trek the Great Himalayan Trail on a 65-day, 1,480-kilometer trek in Nepal from east to west. His route took him through some of the world's most amazing and difficult landscapes as he trekked through Himalayan foothills, forests, jungles, and remote villages. In total, he passed over 13 5,000-plus meter passes and reached 2 5,000-plus meter base camps while exposed to all kinds of weather conditions. You can learn more about his adventure at easttowestnepal.org. Doc McKerr, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Hello, thank you.
Doc, you have a very interesting background. Can you tell me about that and how that led you to doing this Great Himalayan trek?
Yeah, until recently I'd spent 7 years in the British Army, and in that time I'd managed to do quite a lot of interesting things, anything from UK-based activities to deploying to Afghanistan. But one of my most unique jobs that I had was between 2009 and 2010, where I was selected to go and be the project engineer for a charity called the Gurkha Welfare Scheme. And during that time, I was in charge of the project cell who delivered school projects to remote villages across Nepal. It was during that time, in 2010, that I'd heard about this new trail which was being established. It was certainly in the very early days. And it was then that I started to get sort of the connection to it. And I thought, it sounds really interesting. I've done my fair share of walking through Nepal, but this sounds a little bit above and beyond anything that I had done before. So that was really the birthplace of the idea. And then last year I knew that I was going to leave the army. And I always thought, well, if I leave the army, I should do something spontaneous, do something which I'll probably never get the opportunity to do again before I settle down and start focusing on a new career. So that's when I decided to do the Great Himalayan Trail after leaving the army.
Doc, pardon my ignorance, but what is Gurkha?
Sorry, the Gurkhas. About 200 years ago, the British Army started to recruit Nepali citizens to work within the British Army. And that was when the British Army was still based in India. And there's always been an historical link between the British Army and Nepal. So, and we still recruit Nepali citizens to come and work and operate within the British Army. And those people are called Gurkhas. So a Gurkha is a Nepali individual, a Nepali citizen, who's working within the British Army as a British soldier.
Now, part of this time, you actually went to a Nepali language program. Tell me about that.
Yeah, prior to anybody working with the Gurkhas, they have to go and do a 3-month language course in Nepal. And for me, this was incredibly important because my staff within the project cell were all Nepali. Within the organization, it was just Nepalis. And of course, that interaction with locals and villagers was incredibly important that I spoke Nepali. For me, it was actually quite a difficult course. I'm by no means a linguist, so it was 10 hard weeks of classroom work, but it was certainly worthwhile. And without that background of languages within Nepal, it certainly would have been far more demanding and more difficult to try and to have achieved what I did across the Great Himalayan Trail.
How long did it take for you to plan your expedition?
From having the idea to starting was about 14 months. But during that time, I actually deployed to Afghanistan, and that was last year in 2012. So when I was in Afghanistan for about 7 months, I didn't really have the opportunity to plan. So it was really when I got back that I started to really get into the detail. So from pen to paper and actually making some headway on the planning to actually get into the start point was around 6 to 7 months.
And what were you doing during the planning. I read through your blog, and you mentioned that it could be quite difficult for somebody else that did not have your connections to be able to get all the permits and the visas. And also you're working on putting together your kit, and you have to think about the weight of everything and how to get your kit as light as possible. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. I'll take the first part of that question first, and then go on to the second part of it. The problem that exists at the moment is because Nepal is broken down into a number of national parks. Each national park has their own rules and regulations. Some of them are called specialist areas, and some of them are just normal national parks. So, for example, the Annapurna region, anybody could turn up, buy a permit, and walk through the Annapurna National Park without a guide or without a porter, and even go on their own. But there's other parks which, by the letter of the national park law, state that you either need a guide or you need to go in with somebody else. And this was a real sticking point for me to start with, because to try and get the authority to go through the national parks on my own was incredibly difficult. I wanted to go through the right channels, because what I didn't want to do was plan my route and be kind of ignorant, because I wanted to promote the route, and if I was going through national parks without the right authorization, I thought I'd just be, it's just not right. So I wanted to do things as official as possible. The only way around it was my connections through the charity into the organization called the Worldwide Fund for Nature. But it was only because I had that connection that I managed to bypass a lot of red tape to get the authority for me to walk through the national parks on my own. So unless you're a Nepali citizen and therefore don't need to have a permit to go through because you're a citizen, you can go anywhere, it would be very difficult to follow my exact route. There's always ways around that. You can bypass the areas where you need to have a guide or go through with two people. But yeah, getting that authorization was actually very difficult. The second part of the question, talking about the kits and the planning, being military was actually quite good, because we try and plan a lot of detail, and we always look at mitigation of risk, or at least understanding the risks prior to anything that we do. And when you're on your own, you have to think of so many different things. Anything from what kit you carry, how much it's going to weigh, how tired you're going to feel after 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to understanding what you will do if you get lost, if you get injured, if you become ill, if something gets stolen or you lose something or things break. So there's a whole contingency behind everything that I did. And that was one of the things which took the longest, actually. The things which helped me to mitigate a lot of these risks was having a foothold in Nepal. So I had some friends, and one of them in particular was a guy called Kiltapa from Gurkha Adventures, who is an ex-Gurkha soldier, so he understands people like myself. He speaks very good English, and he understands the hills of Nepal. So he was my sanity check on a lot of the things that I did. And also I still had friends in the British Army that still work out there. So between those two groups, I was able to fall back onto them if ever required. Although they weren't with me on a day-to-day basis, I always knew that if anything did happen, I'd have somebody back in Kathmandu or in Pokhara to facilitate a rescue if one was ever required. There's safety equipment which I carried along the way. I carried a mobile phone with a couple of different SIM cards, although realistically I only got mobile phone coverage probably about a third of the way, or a third of the total distance. I had satellite phone with solar to go with it, and I also had a thing called a yellow brick tracking system, which is a GPS and iridium tracking device. So the great thing about this, it worked all across the trail. It tracked my position. It sent a message every 2 hours to my website, and then updated it onto Google Maps, so that people in Kathmandu, in Pokhara, and even back home could see exactly where I was and where I'd gone that day. And with that device, I could send messages to either my friends to say, right, I'm okay, or even just to my blog, which I did on a daily basis. But the beautiful thing about it was people could send me information as well. So if they knew that the weather conditions were going to be pretty bad for the next week at above 4,000 to 5,000 meters, they could send me a quick message to say, right, just be aware that between the following dates, the weather may change. If it wasn't for that particular piece of equipment with the satellite phone and everything else, mitigating any form of risk would have been very difficult indeed. And I don't think I would have got any form of insurance either. So it was money well spent as far as I was concerned.
Tell me about the insurance.
Yeah, the insurance started off to be quite a tricky situation. I spoke to a couple of different insurance companies and they wouldn't touch me. They thought it was too risky. And then I got in touch with the Austrian Alpine Club and they said, yeah, we'll look into it. They looked into it and they said, yeah, no problems, so long as you pay an additional fee per day over the 8 weeks which you're normally allocated. So actually, it wasn't as much of an issue that I thought it was, but it's only because they were so understanding from the outset that it became a lot easier than I originally thought.
Doc, were you able to fund this expedition all by yourself?
Yeah, the idea was to raise as much money as possible for charity. So any money that I raised went directly to the two charities. So I was always keen that I would fund this expedition from my own pocket. I did manage to get some form of sponsorship. It wasn't really financial sponsorship, but it was through kits and equipment. For example, Garmin, they gave me a GPS. I got some discounts off my yellow brick. I got a camera off Nikon. So there's all these, and I got some solar off Power Monkey Extreme. So there's all these little things which help to offset your overall costs for the expedition.
Let's talk about the trail itself. What do people need to know about it?
I think the main thing people need to know about it is the fact that it's there. It's a new trail that a lot of people don't know even exists. The reason why it exists is because the people involved in the Great Himalayan Trail Development Program want to expose people to new, exciting, beautiful places of Nepal that they wouldn't normally go to. The common areas people go to at the moment are places like Annapurna, Everest, and Chitwan, which is the national park in the south. And that area forms a triangle, and they basically refer to it as the Golden Triangle. Those areas get a lot of money, and there's a lot of other remote places which, are incredibly underdeveloped. And tourism would be the prime way of trying to move some of this money into those areas for their own development. Another thing that people need to be made aware of is, although it's one trail, it links up a lot of existing trails. So there are sections which are very remote, but there's other sections which, there are tea houses. They're very basic, but there are tea houses. So it is possible to go through, get resupply and have, a good night's sleep in someone's house or whatever. Another good thing about the trail is it's so versatile. Although I did one particular route, people could change it. They could say, well, I don't want to go high on this one. I'm happy to stay between 3,000 and 4,000 meters and drop down onto maybe the lower cultural trail or some other small trails. So it's the fact that it's there, the fact that it's a great opportunity to see some of the things which they would never normally see, and the fact that it's incredibly versatile as well.
So you mentioned there is this high route and then there's the low route. Can you quickly explain the difference? Yeah,
of course. The high route goes all the way through the mountains, and the lower route goes through the mid-hills. The lower route is referred to as the cultural trail, and because Nepal is so diverse with its villages, its caste systems, and its traditions, it hits as many different types of castes and villages all the way through. My trek was predominantly the high route, but where I couldn't continue through the Himalayas because of safety and through the lack of technical ability on my own, I would drop down onto the cultural section.
How was the weather during your trek?
The weather, I thought the weather would be better than it was to start with, but monsoon was coming in slightly earlier. And for people that don't know, monsoon normally comes in around June, July, and it comes in from the east. So that's why I started in the east and moved west, because I always wanted to be ahead of the weather. But sadly, when I started walking on the 1st of April, every day from about 1 o'clock, I could set my watch by it, it would rain, which didn't really bother me too much, but it was just frustrating because it would slow you down. The paths became very slippy and muddy, and then as you walk through the lower regions where the trees were, obviously you sort of get a lot of leeches coming your way, which was just more frustrating more than anything else. At altitude, it wasn't too bad. However, because there was those rain clouds coming in from the east, towards the back end of the day, visibility would reduce somewhat. So the first 3 weeks weren't particularly great in the afternoon, and then I managed to break out of that rain cloud, and then it was okay. Up until the last 2.5 weeks of the trek, and then again, the clouds started to come in. But again, it was just the fact that monsoon was coming into Nepal a little bit earlier than usual.
So how are you navigating? Are you using your GPS? Do you have maps, or did you ever get lost?
Yeah, for navigation, I had a GPS with me, but I didn't use it to navigate. I had a series of maps which you can get through the Great Himalayan Trail development program. They're anything from 100,000, or 1 in 100,000, all the way through to 1 in 150,000 scale. And anybody who's done a lot of map reading before will understand that they're not great in navigating and for trekking. So they were the only forms of maps that I had. On the whole, they weren't too bad. The detail's pretty good. There's a few discrepancies. However, the development program are aware of them and are making some modifications to them. Because the valleys are so big and so distinctive, it's relatively easy to identify where you are, give or take 100 meters or so, because you can identify valleys, you can identify certain bending rivers. The problem came when the weather became so bad that I couldn't see across the other side of the valley. So as I was walking, I couldn't see reference points. So that became quite tricky. And then you'd have to revert back to old school navigation, map, compass, pacings, or for me, I'd use my GPS and then work out what altitude I am, what altitudes I need to get to, and kind of go through that way of navigating, which could be quite slow and quite draining, especially towards the end of the day. Going over the passes was also a little bit tricky, especially early on over a pass called Lumbasongba, which is on the eastern side of Nepal. Because the maps for that area were 1 in 150,000, it was actually quite difficult to navigate across because, a small peak that might be very prominent on the ground might not be big enough to be on the map. So that became a little bit frustrating, but I managed to get across after a few wrong turns here and there. I did shortly after cross the Lumbasongba Pass, however, get lost in the trees for around 2 days. After I crossed over the Lumbasongba Pass and got caught in a big storm and managed to gate crash a yak herder's tent, who very kindly said I could stay the night. But I was always behind schedule for the following day. But I went through a village, and they kind of said to me, the route to the next village, which was 12 hours of hard walking, is okay. So I went, right, okay. There was a small hut halfway, and I thought if I can get to the hut tonight, I'll be very happy. However, as I walked down the valley and then started to go through the trees, it was one of those classic examples where there was lots of yak routes, lots of goat routes, and I basically thought I took the route which was on the map, and it led me into the trees in completely the wrong direction. In hindsight, I should have stopped, turned back, but I was adamant that I was on the right track. And then a storm came in, and then I needed to find somewhere to hide out the weather conditions, but I had to keep going because the terrain was so steep and there was nowhere to put up my tent or no rocks to hide under. So I ended up having to keep walking and walking and walking. And then I got to the top of the ridgeline, found something which was the most flattest part that I'd seen. So I pitched my tent and just went, right, let the storm pass, and then tomorrow will be a different day. At this point, I'd got so far into the trees that the following day was incredibly difficult to try and get back on track, and a number of attempts of trying to dissect the route that I needed to, that they sort of, it didn't work because I just came up against like 40-foot drops as I tried to certain re-entrance, and then going back up through the thick vegetation to the path where I was at originally that day was just so hard work. So I had to spend another night in the trees as the weather came in again at about midday. And it wasn't until the following day that I managed to break out of the trees and back onto the track that I needed to be on. And I was really lucky, actually. So I think someone was looking out for me that day, because I actually bumped into a family who were heading in the same direction as I needed to. And it was great because they were great fun on the way, and made sure that I got to the village at the right time and in the right place. So apart from that slightly uncomfortable experience of being in the trees for 2 days on my own, and the rest of it, I took a few wrong turns here and a few wrong turns there, but on the whole, it wasn't too bad.
You mentioned some of the interaction you had with the locals. Overall, how did they receive you?
The locals in Nepal are renowned for being incredibly friendly, and like with all societies, you'll get people which are incredibly friendly and those which aren't. Thankfully, I always had more exposure to those people that were incredibly friendly than those that weren't. Even the people in between are just basically very curious. If you're an outsider going through somebody's village, that obviously people are going to take an interest. A lot of it is just curiosity. They're traditionally very suspicious and very curious people anyway, whether you're a Westerner or whether you're just a Nepali from another valley just walking through. But after you establish a rapport, and after you break down those initial barriers, they were incredibly friendly. There was times when I'd walk with Nepalis for a day or with 2 days, or I'd get into a village, I wouldn't know where to stay, and then I'd talk to people and they'd say, yeah, come stay with me, or, yep, there's a woman who has a homestay at the top of the village, you tell her I told you to go there and stay there. So, on that respect, it was very good. And then there was times when I wasn't too sure which direction to go, which path to take. Not once did I have a problem. Everybody was always very willing to help. But the main reason I was able to establish the rapport and have such good interaction with the majority of people that I met was because of the language and the understanding of the culture. Without that, it would have been incredibly difficult.
Doc, how many nights would you say that you camped in your tent versus staying in someone's house, for example?
I'd actually planned for far more than I did. In the end, I think it was around 12 nights that I camped either under a big rock, so it was a bivvy, or in my own tent. The rest of the times was in either a tea house, somebody's home, or even a hotel if it was in like the main tourist areas. So I actually didn't spend that many times underneath canvas. But it was planned because for anybody else that experiences long walks, it's far easier and far more comfortable to spend a night under cover, because then the following day your routine is very quick. You don't have to worry about cooking. You're more comfortable, you're dry, your kit isn't wet because of condensation of the rain, so your bag is light the following day. So that's why I'd always push where possible to keep on going and keep on going to the next village.
So Doc, how did your body hold up on this trip?
It was actually surprisingly good. Prior to starting, I actually thought that I hadn't prepared well enough. And really my focus before going was concentrating on the small areas of the body which I thought would take the hit the most. So that's the ankles, the knees, and the back. Thankfully, because of the 8.5-day walk in, to the start line, which for me was Kanchenjunga Base Camp, that actually gave me quite a decent amount of time to acclimatize and to sort of appreciate the terrain which was coming my way. That said, it was still very demanding on the body. Overall, I lost 2.5 stone, which is around 16 kilograms. Thankfully, I'd put the weight on before I left, so at least I had it to lose. Overall, my body was good, but towards the end of the trek, it started to really feel the pain. And the last 5,000 meter pass that I went up, I was really shuffling. At night, I'd wake up with pains in my hip and my lower back, but they're all manageable. There was nothing which was debilitating, which was good. Thankfully, my feet held out as well. I had 3 small blisters throughout the duration of the trek, and that was a combination of good foot preparation, and I think you're either one of those lucky people, you get blisters or you don't, and on the whole, I don't, which was good news.
So how do you keep up your motivation, even considering, blisters and all of that?
Yeah, from a motivation perspective, it wasn't too bad. This was one of the grey areas which I was a bit concerned about before I left. I thought, I'm a relatively motivated individual, but I've never spent so much time in my own company. And your mind wanders for anybody that has done something very similar. And you just got to keep focused. On a daily basis, I would think of 3 things. I would think of where I was going that day. The next thing I would think about is where I'm going to get to at the end of that phase, because I'd broken the trek down into a number of phases. And then finally, all I thought about was the finish line. Because I'd done the trek into the Tibetan border before, I could visualize it. I knew exactly what it looked like. So they were the things which I would think about on a daily basis. The first one would change on a daily basis. That keeps you mentally stimulated. The second aspect, the phases, that would change every couple of weeks. So again, they're nice little achievable hurdles. And then finally, you've always got that final goal that you're always clawing your way to. And above and beyond all that, I think anybody who's sort of a similar ilk hates the fact that, or just doesn't want to fail. And for me, that's quite important. So regardless of how hot it was or how cold it was, how wet it was, how dry it was, how hungry I was, I'd always just keep going and going and going.
What do people need to know about the dangers of the trail and how to mitigate those dangers?
The dangers of any trail, I think, people have got to understand that this is an incredibly remote part. Although people do walk through them, whether it be tourists or locals moving cattle or moving from one valley to another, it is still incredibly remote. The weather can and will change on a regular basis, so people just have to make sure that they're ready for any eventuality. Having a support network behind them, not literally, but somewhere based in the country that is following their progress on a daily basis, for me is essential. Thankfully, nothing happened along the way. I got ill a couple of times, but it was minimal in comparison to what could have happened. But I always knew that if anything did happen, within a couple of days, that safety net would have been activated and in a position where they'd come and rescue me. There was numerous times when I'd be walking and, you daydream because you have a lot of time to think. And you take a little bit of a slip right near the edge of a cliff face or right next to a river, and that would also all of a sudden bring you back to reality. And then you just go, right, I've really got to keep my wits about me. There was one day I fell through a bamboo bridge, and there was a big drop below. Thankfully, I managed to grip hold of the rock that was next to me. But again, small things like that I wasn't taking any more risk than normal, but you just have to be aware that, sometimes something will go wrong and it'll be outside of your control. With regards to safety of the locals, generally speaking, there are no problems in Nepal. But like every country, there has been incidences in the past. And again, it's just understanding the environment that people are going to go through that'll be key. So prevention is always better than cure. So this is why some people always recommend going with a local guide or going in groups of people. I didn't. I was an exception to the rule, but I was always confident that the fact that I'd lived in the country for 18 months, spoke the language, and had that support network behind me, that was good enough for me to do what I did.
Doc, if you had to do, or if you were to do this trip again, is there one thing that you would do different?
It's a good question. I keep asking myself this. I'll get a tent that didn't leak is one of the things I'd do. I'd have done it earlier, is what I'd have done. I started walking from Taplajung on the 1st of April, and if I had my time again, I would have started walking on the 1st of March, because I would have had better weather. I'd have had more consistent weather. That would have been my top thing that I would have done differently.
What's your biggest takeaway from this expedition?
My biggest takeaway is that regardless of the challenge, so long as you really want it, and so long as you plan it thoroughly, I think anybody is capable of doing whatever they want. It was one of those things that in the early stages people thought I was a bit mad and a bit crazy, thinking, oh, what do you want to do that for? Has anyone done it before? So, well, people have done bits of it before, but as far as I'm aware, no one's done the whole thing solo. And they'd always be quite dismissive. But for me, anybody who's dismissive against an idea that I have just makes me want to do it even more. So the biggest takeaway is that if you want to do something and you put the plans in place for you to allow to be successful, then I think you will be successful.
Doc, what's next for you?
At the moment, I've gone back to school, actually. I'm studying for my MBA at the University of Cranfield, but I've got some ideas in the pipeline for maybe a year and a half to 2 years' time. I'm thinking climbing, I'm thinking rowing, but what it is, I don't know. I think I'm going to have to be slightly realistic and see what awaits after school, because I need to get a job. I've got to pay for it somehow. But there will be another adventure somewhere in the next couple of years.
How can people contact you and learn more about this expedition?
People can contact me directly through the website. And my email address is easttowestnepal@gmail.com. And people have already sent me some emails to say, I'm looking at doing this, but not all of it. What time of year do you think I should go? What were your biggest highlights on this particular section? I'll be more than willing to answer any questions that people have.
Doc McKerr, thank you so much for coming on the show. Congratulations on your accomplishment, and good luck with school. Good luck on your next expedition.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Recorded October 27, 2013. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.